Thank you, and welcome everyone to today's conversation for the Transform Finance Investor Network. You'll notice soon that this is not our traditional webinar format, but it's more of a conversation on supporting capital strategies for worker justice. This comes as a culmination of a year-long work that my colleague Eric Horvath has been leading as a program manager for community and social justice partnerships here at Transform Finance. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the executive director at Transform Finance and the convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network. And besides Eric, we'll be joined today, for which I'm very grateful, by Scott Klinger of Jobs with Justice and Afifa Halik from the SCIU FPSU, both of whom were members of this year's cohort on worker justice. So you will hear from them shortly. Couple of updates, as always, for those that have heard us speaking for so long about our work on investing in employee ownership conversions via a private equity model. That report is now out. We're very excited to see that it has gotten some good play. We've already gotten some great feedback, and we're now entering, in some way, a next phase in which we're trying to see what we can do to put it into practice to make sure that there are some funds that pick up this idea of creating more broad-based employee ownership with some strong guardrails around the impact, the centering of the workers, and taking a non-extractive approach. We would love to hear from you about that, both if you are a practitioner with some insights as to how this can best be done, and especially if you are on the investment side and you're interested either in having a fund of this sort. We've heard of a few ideas that are coming up around that, or being an LP in such a fund. So please do reach out, and you will find the report on our website under briefings. Couple of new topics that we've recently started working on and would welcome your thoughts on as well, as and also your expertise. One is on a question of equitable media, broadly defined as media that addresses historically underserved populations, either in terms of being owned by such populations or catering to them. And there's an issue of strong underinvestment there. So we're trying to figure out what holds back more investments, if it's an issue that media is a hard sector to invest in at the early stage in the first place, or if it has to do with the equitable media piece itself or the revenue strategies around it. So with the idea of figuring out if we can have more capital, more aligned capital flowing into media companies that are advancing equity. So if that's a topic dear to your heart, please do let us know. And another project that you've heard us mention before is a landscape, similarly, of worker organizing efforts, kind of tech-enabled worker voice, worker power efforts that could be investable, as well as anti-corruption initiatives that could also be investable. If you know of any of those, and surely many of you know about ALIA or know about Coworker and similar efforts, please do get in touch. We can chat about those. Logistics for today, please do mute yourself, and you should feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or use, as always, the chat function that we will be monitoring to send us questions and comments. There's also a Q&A function if you prefer to use that, where there will be a discussion session towards the end of this presentation as well, if you want to wait for that. But as always, they're supposed to be somewhat interactive, so we'd love to hear from you. Now, on to today's topic, called the Capital Strategies for Worker Justice. We just completed this cohort of worker justice organizations that were looking at developing and launching new strategies to intersect with the world of finance. in novel ways. I think that novel is important because many worker justice organizations have historically looked at finance as a target of their strategies, but not always with a sense of collaboration or really viewing the finance piece as potential agents of change or as potential allies and partners on a particular worker justice issue. You see that the logos of the 6 organizations that were chosen out of 18 or so to participate this year. Eric will tell you a lot more about that and the process. Now, if you're on the line, I imagine it's because you think this is relevant to you, but I figured I would try to frame that in a little bit. We always talk about building a bridge between the world of social justice and the world of finance. And this is a prime example where clearly capital flows affect worker justice issues, generally not so positive. And there isn't a very explicit bridge where worker justice organizations can influence the way in which those capital flows affect workers. So you often hear about our work with investors or our work with social justice leadership, but we thought this would be a good opportunity to really bring it all together. And I'm delighted to see that among the attendees, there is a great mix of investors, of movement builders, of social justice leaders as well. So let's see if we can really break down a little bit that wall. And with respect to the role that investors can play, of course, we have visited in the past the issues around shareholder resolutions, for example, on the pay gap or other issues that affect workers. But we've been thinking more intentionally, and this has been coming up in conversations with you all, about what the right role for investors is. Whether the investors should be the ones that drive these interventions, or if they should really be subsumed to the movement or to worker justice actors themselves, for whom then the investors become a conduit, as opposed to the investors off in their corner doing their thing. And within the cohort, as you'll see, the strategies were very much worker justice driven as opposed to investor driven, but they see the investor as a crucial component for their success. And lastly, think of it as an opportunity to really help out and in some ways be true to the statements that we often hear from many progressive investors, impact investors, and family offices that say, oh yeah, we want to help, we want to drive social justice outcomes. Well, hopefully what you hear today will give you a sense of some of the ways, obvious and non-obvious, in which this can be done. So I'm hoping that you will find this all relevant as well as actionable. Now, more broadly, what is this opportunity that that we see? What is the need and the role that that we all can play? So there is a moment on both sides that again is probably not news to you, that looks a little bit different from the last decade or so. And it's made up on one side of a certain willingness on the part of investors to recognize other stakeholders. Once again, we can drop in a reference to the Business Roundtable announcement or to Larry Fink's annual letters. And this interest, this kind of new approach on the part of investors is met by also a new willingness on the part of social justice leaders to engage around capital in new ways, to explore new partnerships. What we saw there then was, okay, how can we capture this moment of interest? And what seemed to be missing was really a bit of what I've heard called progressive infrastructure, right? The bones and the technical assistance, the general knowledge for those who want to take advantage of this moment to actually do so. And we would be hard pressed to say to social justice organizations to start getting into conversations with prominent, fairly traditional investors, unless they are given some of the infrastructure and the support to do so. And so we've been framing this as an opportunity for us to say, hey, we sit at this intersection. We have relationships on both sides. We know a little bit on either side. Maybe we can try to draw the two groups a little bit more closely together. But again, viewing the investors as social change agents, as the ones who will be putting into practice the aspirations, the needs, and the strategies that worker justice organizations are bringing up. And we see this relevantly for the values-based approach that Transform Finance brings to the work as part of a broader power shift, really, where it's not just the investors calling the shots, but there is a recognition of the legitimacy of voices from workers and from other stakeholders that hopefully will grow into an actual recognition of the value that comes from these other voices. Breaking down the dichotomy of labor versus capital, but saying no. Oftentimes we can find ways in which those interests can be aligned. Now, what did we hope to get out of the cohort? And hopefully from Scott and Afifa, we'll hear whether we seem to be on the right track. We're looking to complement the current strategies that organizations such as Jobs with Justice and SCIU, FPSU have already, right? There's not a substitution. As always, we say that finance is a new arena in which they can play, but by all means, it should not supplement the prior strategies that they had. We're hoping to see real change. We're hoping to see adoption on the part of investors of the strategies that are being proposed, whether it's a change in an investment policy, or it's a matter of including certain covenants in a municipal finance bonds, or adopting some of the recommendations from worker justice organizations, say around best practices around contract workers in venture capital-backed startups. We want to more generally increase the power of these organizations, right? Put another arrow in their quiver that might be relevant now or at a later point. And showing that this can be done, that it is possible, even despite the history of exclusion from conversations around capital, for worker justice organizations to get into it and do something a little bit novel. And we're hoping that this would foster replication from other organizations. So we will see, if we are successful, more and more efforts by social justice actors in a variety of different issue areas to say, actually, yeah, let's look at how capital is affecting our work and what we can do about it, and trying to forge some new paths within that. So now that we've done the cohort for 1 year, there are, of course, as always, next steps. We will try, first of all, to capture some insights, looking back over the past year into what has worked, how this might have some broader implications for worker justice organizations and for organizing more generally around finance. We want to see what it is that can activate social justice organizations, again, that have generally stayed away from the world of finance, and what can sustain them in this work. What is it that brings them in and keeps them at it, despite the fact that, of course, it takes time and resources and a meaningful amount of effort, frankly, but something must be appealing there. And as another next step, we will be starting in 2020 a new cohort. So we would like social justice actors, we would like investors, we would like funders to get involved. With respect to funders in particular, going back to the point about the progressive infrastructure, we think that this is something that can be brought up with grantees and say, hey, have you thought about looking into new strategies around capital in order to strengthen your work? So regardless of which hat you're wearing, would love for you to be in touch, learn some more, and see if you can get involved with us in this work. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Eric Horvath, with great congratulations for pulling off this cohort this year.
All right, hi everyone, and thanks, Andrea. I'm really excited to be presenting on this.
We've been working on it for about a year, and it just culminated at Amalgamated Bank last Friday with our finale and showcase. Just before I kick it off, I'm going to spend about 10-15 minutes kind of explaining to all what we did over the last year. I think Andrea did a good job framing some of our hopes, our ambitions, our challenges for it, and what our next steps are. But I'm going to kind of talk you through a little bit of the genesis and some of the kind of meat and potatoes of it. And before we get into that, I'd be remiss not to mention Vonda Brunsting, our colleague, who was formerly the Director of Capital Stewardship at the SEIU. She was with us pretty much the whole time, calls and planning everything. So we're very indebted to Vonda and her contributions to all of this. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so just quickly, because some kind of foundation setting about like what is the cohort. If I had to put it into a kind of a pithy sentence, especially for those that are on the phone and not looking at the slide deck. Over the last year, we convened 6 labor organizations from around the country, really from the entire country, from Minnesota, Texas, California, as well as Florida, and then 2 other groups that work nationally. So we convened 6 labor organizations from around the country, paired them with coaches and with financial expertise to collaborate and develop capital strategies, all in the service of worker justice. Also, there's a couple quotes from participants that are peppered throughout my slides. Just want to share them aloud. We've been fighting without understanding capital. The Transform Finance Cohort is helping streamline my strands of work around capital, finance, and the economy on our path to win. It's actually from Afifa, who will be presenting in a few minutes. But there's just been a lot of great nuggets of wisdom and kind of surprise and transformation from the participants along the way. So beyond the kind of just general gist, the cohort was 6 labor organizations that met 3 times over the course of a year, and I'll explain what those 3 convenings looked like. Ultimately, we wanted to get them to a point where they developed a capital strategy that was relevant and additive to the mission and their kind of operation and the work that they're doing already. Again, so when Andrea was saying it was not meant to be substitutional or displacing, we want to have this be added into what folks already do. A note on how we kind of look at what capital strategies are. We kind of define them loosely as being ways that these social justice groups can either acquire / deploy or influence capital and financial actors to behave differently, ideally more productively and potentially in partnership and positively for worker justice outcomes. So the table on the right is just some examples that we had from the beginning when we put out the open call for people to apply, and some of them still held and are still fairly illustrative of what we wound up doing. So designing equitable, social-driven structured exits for enterprises, pushing rating agencies or pushing institutional investors to incorporate certain metrics as defined by workers into their investment policies. Next slide. And then another thing that's pretty interesting about the cohort is when I describe it, I would say that there were 2 clear themes or 2 clear buckets. The first theme being all of the groups, first and foremost, represent low-wage workers. Several of our groups were represented, workers through worker centers, unions. So at the end of the day, everyone got up in the morning to represent low-wage workers. And the second theme that was shared was they all applied to the cohort with the idea of they were committed to engaging with capital and financial actors differently. So most of the groups did not have that determined or delineated from the beginning, but they all kind of came in knowing that we need to understand this more, we're committed to understanding it more, and we want to have more avenues in which we can engage productively. But then when I kind of bucketed it out to those 2 core themes, I say that within both of those themes, they're very heterogeneous differentiation. So we had organizations that represented domestic workers, construction workers, and blue-collar workers that work in Silicon Valley on tech campuses. And then in terms of which financial actors or capital interventions people were thinking about. Similarly diffuse in terms of engaging with foundation endowments, labor pension funds, venture capital, private equity professionals, very, very diverse within both of these common themes. And I would say the final theme that's not written on the slide would be over and over again, all of the groups had identified that they wanted to go upstream to where the capital originated, rather than having to basically react and respond to investments that were ultimately harmful. They were interested in how do we get into spaces where we can productively engage and negotiate at the top of the funnel, so to speak. Next slide. So this slide is a lot of fun pictures. It's about why we decided to do this. So just as a first note, I want to kind of thank the Cerna Foundation, who has been supported all of this work around community-facing engagement around finance and capital that we do. So the Cerna Foundation supports all of the folks in these pictures and all the things that we're saying verbally. So, you know, why did we decide to do an advanced cohort when we're doing these other things too? The picture on the top left, and I actually know someone that's on the calls in this photograph, so I'm glad you came back for it, Amy. The picture on the top left is from our flagship institute. We hold those annually. We've held them annually for the last several years in the Bay Area or New York. About 50 social justice actors come together. It's a bit of an onboarding, first touch, 2-day introductory training around finance and social justice. So we know that there's a big appetite. We know that the narrative in terms of finance being relevant, finance mattering and matters, and how it can be used to drive social change. We're kind of establishing that, and we know that that's evident. But from that, we've heard resoundingly from participants that we need to go deeper, and we need to do more than a 2-day kind of annual institute. So from that, this idea, this belief that we have to engage more deeply, we figured we should do something around a cohort that we meet folks several times and bring them kind of from cradle to grave in terms of idea and learning all the way into some form of execution. So the flagship institute on the top left, which is that annual introductory institute, kind of from that we wanted to spin off place-based institutes. We figured folks tend to rally around either a shared location, a place, a city, or their community, or a topic. So on the place-based side, on the image on the right, you can see that we've gone to Atlanta, Phoenix, Cincinnati, Denver, Louisville, and we will go to Portland, Oregon in a couple weeks to do kind of institutes for those cities specifically, because there's more opportunity for follow-up and further engagement. And then on the top part, the kind of topic-based with a question, we thought that you know, if it's not place, it's probably going to be topic oriented. And we figured that given all of the energy around the labor movement and fights for workers' rights on the organizing side, and then all the energy around quality jobs and sustainable business on the investment side, that would be a natural kind of coalescence or convergence of this kind of organizer plus investor bridge. Next slide. So what did the cohort actually do? So the picture on the right would be from our friends Activist. If you don't know them, I'd check them out. They're spelled the word activist plus invest, just put them together. And that's our friend Ryan talking about positive incentives, sustainability linked municipal bonds and loans. So the cohort met 3 times for 2 days each in New York City. So everyone flew in from around the country to come with us, come meet us and convene in New York. For session 1, it was really a learning experience. We had kind of 90-minute rapid fire sessions on private equity, global pension funds, venture capital, and then several other kind of financial actors within the financial ecosystem. And as you'll see with the quote on the top, one of the participants said this is the first time they'd ever heard of ESG. They didn't know what it stood for. So for those that are in the impact investing space, you definitely know that it's a bit pretty core thing. So that was part of the learning part, kind of baseline understanding. The second one was, again, in New York at the NRDC. We had workshopping sessions with coaches, which I'll show on the next slide, that had sectoral expertise in, again, private equity, municipal finance, pension fund capital stewardship, impact finance, law, foundations, real estate investments, venture capital. We paired them strategically with the participating groups based on their interests and the relevant actors in their spaces. And then the most recent one, the launch at Amalgamated Bank last week, was meant to have them share out, this is how we're thinking about engaging with finance and capital for our workers. And they were looking to solicit kind of like calls to support, calls to action for the audience. And then just as a note, in between all of the in-person sessions, we had targeted webinars, targeted connections, and check-in calls with all of the groups based on their needs. Next slide. So just quickly, this is a small sample of the coaches and collaborators that we had throughout the cohort this year. I'd actually say it's about half of them. So I would say about 30 or so folks, with a lot more that were interested. Either were with us in person, coached or provided expertise over the phone, and all of the coaches that started with us in the beginning continued to stay engaged throughout the entire process. Basically, nobody wanted to step away from it. And these are the folks with that kind of experience dealing with those financial actors or working in those financial institutions, that we basically said to them, hi, we have these pretty awesome worker justice organizations that want to understand what you're doing and work more effectively around your space. And are you interested in coming and helping us? Everyone said yes. At some point during the second session with the workshopping, we actually had to turn some people away with the financial expertise because we just didn't have enough groups to pair them with. So we're very confident that there's a huge groundswell of interest from not only the participants, but also the coaches. Next slide. I know I'm coming up to time too, so this is just these are a couple pictures from our launch last Friday. So the top one is from the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the bottom one is from Setul, based in the Twin Cities. And then you'll see the image on the right. We gave out strategic asks and call to action kind of contribution cards. We asked folks for help with connections, financial resources, or ideas and thought leadership. And we're happy to get some pretty good responses from the audience in terms of, we can help, Workers Defense Project with X, or we can help Working Partnerships USA with Y. And we're going to actually offer all the participants on the phone, as well as anyone that signed up for the webinar, an opportunity to contribute similarly. So keep your eye out for that. Next slide. And so, we kind of outlined capital strategies a little bit. We're going to actually hear from two of the groups right after I speak, so I'm not going to steal their thunder too much. And then one or two of our groups also asked for some kind of anonymity because of the sensitivity of the issues that they're working on. But just to kind of try to give you a little more shape to the capital strategies and capital engagements piece, again, the actors were quite diffuse, and these are actually ones derived from our participants. Folks are going to be working with, in partnership with, venture capital, public pension funds, foundation endowments, private equity professionals. Pretty resoundingly, the approaches are around partnership, translating their kind of worker voice and their social impact metrics around workers into investor ease or investor speak. And it's really around influence and partnerships, much more so than antagonism or opposition. And then just a couple examples. The National Domestic Workers Alliance had a great article in Forbes, written by Morgan a couple months ago, about their ability to invest in enterprises that are creating quality jobs for domestic workers. Several of the groups are interested in working with asset owners around their investments, about how they can incorporate better worker-driven labor standards. And then, so we'll move on to the last slide, second to last slide. Okay, so some quick Transform Finance observations. I definitely felt the appetite and enthusiasm for this work from the participants and from the coaches increased over time. From the person that said, I've never heard of ESG before on the organizer side. Oh yeah, or the vast majority of our cohort participants were labor organizers. From the person that said they hadn't heard of ESG at the first time, by October, she asked me, do you have a finance dictionary you can share with me? So just a straight finance dictionary, just, dry stuff. She just wanted to know all of it. And then, so we definitely saw this increase in appetite and enthusiasm to learn about finance and investment. Second, kind of unplanned positive outcomes. The groups have come to collaborate around a joint project. I won't steal their thunder now, but very organically, because I think they're all interested in worker issues. They all got along very well and saw a lot of overlaps for potential collaboration. Again, the sustained and growing interest from the coaches. And then several of the groups have also said that not only are they interested in their specific strategy, but they're looking into how they can incorporate kind of a financial analysis or investment kind of strategy across their entire organization. So that's what we had hoped for all along. We wanted them to develop discrete strategies, but then also how can they kind of take this and add this to their holistic kind of theory of change or approach to change. And several of the groups have really internalized that on their own and tried to integrate that into all of their work. And then the last slide, we'll talk about how there's a lot of shared needs across the organizations. So we can go on to the final slide. Yeah, so just this idea of building the infrastructure, not really, a bit of a play on words because a handful of the groups were interested in construction workers. The groups really articulated that they wanted to find a way to translate worker voices, which they know very well because that's who they directly represent, into investment decisions. So the way that we at Transform Finance have thought about that is, what does the S look like in the ESG? How, that's the least fleshed out between the E and the S and the G. And we saw a lot of alignment in terms of how can we take the worker voices that are essentially an S, and then how can we find folks that know how to make it into an ESG argument that would be more appealing and suitable for investors. We have enforcement of worker-driven labor standards. They need help in terms of monitoring and enforcement, even if they do get their labor standards to the level that they want incorporated into investment theses. Folks want an ecosystem mapping of financial actors that affect their work. And then people really wanted access and training around financial databases. So if folks are familiar with Bloomberg Terminal or Preqin, things that several of our organizers or researchers that they could learn how to use, but they simply don't have the financial or, as of now, the technical expertise to be able to sift through more sets of databases. So I'm gonna leave my section at that. And obviously we'll have Q&A later, and we'll be following up after the webinar with some materials. But I want to hand it over to Afifa from the SEIU Florida Public Services Union to talk a little bit about her experience and what they're working on down in Florida.
Hi all, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So it was a very interesting experience, like, coming from labor organizing, that we always have been traditionally organized against capital and against the institutions of the capital structures, right? And coming into this realization pretty early on that this is not going to work. So where it all started, and I will just quickly go through the whole historic analysis of what we have done in our communities. If we do, beside the traditional labor union organizing, which is like with the worksite bargaining and a new member bringing into the union organizing, we are pretty much invested in our communities too, because we believe that, unless we improve the quality of life in our communities and the economic justices in our communities, the whole inspirational idea of that building the standard for working families will not be achieved. So we have been door knocking with our community members. We have been talking to them or working with them along issue campaigns, which may or may not directly relate to the union workers. So those were all the issues that we were working on. And what we have realized that the economy is not working for an average worker. Right? It's no matter what we do in terms of bargaining, and no matter how much wage increases we negotiate, it's still the situation is the same. And especially when you start going into the communities of color and realize the economic injustices that exist within those communities, there were realization that we cannot keep on maintaining the status quo. One of our cohort member who presented during the last session too is actually from Delray Beach, the southwest neighborhood of Delray Beach, which is a historic Black 1,000-acre of Black neighborhood. And when their family moved into that neighborhood in 1940s, almost 85 to 90% of that neighborhood was owned by Black communities. They were thriving. There was 173 businesses. People, like 90% of the people own their homes, to the situation that is now. And there's like a lot of different historical events that happened along with the war on drugs, and the introduction of Wall Street to the communities and how the wealth started extracting, that the situation right now is where the community owns 43% of the land. The rest of them is owned by the investors and CRAs. At the same time, out of like 173 businesses that were thriving and flourishing in those communities, there are 16 businesses that exist as of today. So those are concerns for us that, there is something that is not working. And then you take that Delray Beach, that 1,000-acre is not the only community that we are talking about. So whether you talk about Riviera Beach, which is the only Black coastal community left, or South St. Petersburg, or Little Haiti in Miami, or Orlando District 6, or East Tampa, the east of Jacksonville, wherever those communities exist, it's not working. The economy is not working for them. So there has to be something that is done differently. And one of the key factors that whenever we were knocking on the doors, there were two things that people would always talk about: the jobs and affordable housing. It was a key concern. No matter which neighborhood we go to, those were the two things that people will always bring up as their issues that they're concerned about. And when we look into the statistics and data of it, it makes sense. In South Florida, average Black community member is spending 58% of their income on housing, which is nationwide is 44% is the average, which is still high, but that's the average. And then when we look into the home ownership rates in Black communities too, where 71% of the white community members have home ownership, that home ownership drops when it comes to Black communities to 41% or 45% in Latinx communities. So those, when we look at those statistics and we know that things are not working and there needs to be something that should be done differently. So we looked into a lot of different avenues and how can we bring the worker power back and give the communities the rights that they deserve. Because it's not that they cannot live in those communities or they're not working, they're working poor. These are the terms that exist now, that you can be working a full-time job and be poor. And, for instance, the Delray Beach, that same 1,000-acre neighborhood that I'm talking about, it produces, the Delray Beach as a whole produces $10 billion annually in wages and benefits. $1 billion of that is coming from that 1,000-acre. So they are making money, but that money is coming out of the community at a greater speed than being invested in the community. So with all of those perspectives, we are working on 4 different frames, which is how are we building the power in workers through wages and benefits? how are we creating an economic ecosystem by creating economic vehicles that will be tasked with stopping that extraction of wealth from happening? How are we building around politics and policy to change some of the practices and some of the laws and policies that exist that is maintaining or adding on to the status quo? And lastly, how are we talking to the people in their communities about capital economy and wealth creation and the extraction? There's a public narrative space that needs to happen, right? So what we decided, instead of like that 1% versus 99% narrative, let's try to understand capital, and let's try to understand where it's coming from. And Transform Finance came at the very right moment, where we were like, okay, this is perfect opportunity for us to interact with capital in a different way. So that was like, the reason that we joined the cohort. And when we were working at the cohort and affordable housing was an issue, we were like, okay, can we look into creating an economic vehicle that will be tasked with affordable housing? And we started looking into different forms. We have a CDFI that we are working on and working with. We have another CDFI that just does affordable housing. And then we have like a credit union that is like, to give access to capital to our communities. But while we were looking into all of those strategies, we identified that, in order to create an economic ecosystem, you have to create different vehicles too, not just like, one form that is tasked with doing just one thing. And private equity came in as as an institution to invest solely in affordable housing in Florida economy, because of various different factors, including investor trust in the model, and how can we flow the capital, and how can we have a democratic governance system along with a separate management system that can do the professional work that the private equity fund can do. So what we are working on with Transform Finance is the capital strategy that we have is setting up a private equity fund. We are calling it a community wealth fund for housing justice. And the fund will invest in affordable housing, particularly in the communities of color. We are looking into various social justice ESG frameworks within that to how can we improve the standard for the labor working in the construction industry or property management and those industries, or how can we develop more green construction practices, or how can we have renter as part of the decision making to improve their chances of home ownership, because the ultimate goal is to increase the home ownership in the communities of color. What we have learned from the day one, the first day, and I was joking with Eric too, our presentation on day one to the last day was completely different, because there was a bunch of information and knowledge that came into play. Many of the coaches, and I should not name just one of them, because all of them gave many different directions. They asked questions that led us to do more deep dive and more deep thinking into this world, and also given us advice on how can we have this fund structured in a better way, or what are the resources that are available, so the networks, the connections of it, the information and knowledge. So there's a bunch of learning that happened throughout the process, which was it became very meaningful for us that gave us the next step. So we are still in the exploration phase, and that exploration phase, we were able to shortlist the stuff that we need to work on through this 1-year learning process. And in terms of the support that we need or we are looking for, if you can go to the next slide, which is our ask. Basically, we're looking we're setting up a core committee of 5 to 7 people that will be working with us in developing this structure, the governance structure, the democratic governance structure, the management structure, the legal work, the taxation policies, and everything. So the committee is intended to work from January to March to help us design this fund. And then we are also looking for the pro bono legal support during those 3 months who can advise on, like, how we should structure this fund. That will obviously go into, like, once we go into setting it up, that will not be pro bono anymore, but in initial phases when we're doing those deep dive into it. We're also looking to work with an external equity fund manager who aligns with our values and principles, and also the seed money to get the technical or legal assistance required to help set this fund up. So that's basically what we are working on.
Great. Thank you so much, Asifa. That was extremely helpful, and we'll go back to these asks afterwards for the investors who might be interested in supporting your work. Very important stuff. I'm glad to hear that the cohort was helpful in moving this work forward. Scott Klinger from Jobs with Justice. Thank you, thank you, Scott.
Thanks so much, and hello, everyone. I'm really glad you could join us for this important call. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jobs with Justice and the project we've been working on, the work we did with the cohort, and then I look forward to some questions and discussion afterwards. Jobs with Justice is a 32-year-old organization founded on expanding working people's ability to organize and collectively bargain for better wages and benefits, and for improvements to conditions in their communities where they live and work. Our network operates in 36 cities and 23 states across the country, and we fight on behalf of hundreds of thousands of workers. Over the last 9 years, one sector of interest to us has been the construction sector, which we know offers wealth-generating, family-sustaining careers. For those in the construction trades with union representation, the average wage is $27 an hour, plus retirement and health care benefits that can follow the worker from job to job. Okay, so construction workers without unions earn significantly less and are often exposed to unsafe conditions and wage theft. Discrimination also plagues the industry. Women comprise just 3% of construction jobs, and 3 in 10 women reported high levels of harassment on the job site. Racial minorities often end up in non-union jobs or in low-paying occupations within union sectors. And Latinx workers are far more likely to be killed on their job than other minorities or white workers. For the last several years, we've worked to promote job quality and diversity construction, partnering with our coalitions in Denver and Central Florida. But we've recognized as a national organization that we're in a position to significantly scale up the work. To do that, we're focusing on apprenticeships. Apprenticeships is a key means by which those with few resources or education can access construction careers. 3/4 of construction apprentices are trained by centers run jointly by contractors and unions, where workers are paid as they learn. Apprentices don't pay tuition. All of their apprenticeship training programs are free because the centers are funded by $1.3 billion a year of union member dues. So union and supportive contractors are making the investment in creating new supplies of women and people of color eager to work on construction jobs. But we've realized that more is needed, that we need to work with asset owners in order to increase demand for those workers. It's imperative that those who own and finance construction projects understand the importance of increasing demand for more apprentices and trained workers who are people of color and women, as these programs are how women and people of color and formerly incarcerated people can access lifelong careers. To that end, last February, we co-sponsored a meeting with Mission Investors Exchange, the Ford Foundation, and the Novo Foundation in New York City at Ford's newly renovated headquarters in which we focused on the role foundations can play in building access and equality in construction. Our room of foundations and other institutional investors collectively represented hundreds of billions of dollars of assets. We celebrated the achievements of both Ford and Novo in achieving tremendous diversity and job quality goals for the workforces that renovated their respective headquarters. Just to give you some numbers, the average women labor content on a building project in New York is about 3%, and both Ford got to over 25%, Novo got to over 33% female content on their jobs. The highlight of the Ford gathering was the stories of 3 tradeswomen who shared what their construction careers meant to them, their families, and their communities. In our Transform Finance presentation last Friday, 2 additional sheet metal workers shared their stories. Last Friday, we listened to Ariana, a 14-year sheet metal journeywoman who started her career fresh out of high school. She shared that her career empowered her and gave her the skills to thrive. When later in life she encountered domestic violence, she knew that she had a good job and would be okay as she provided for herself and her 3 kids in her new life as a single mom. We also heard from Raquel, a second-year sheet metal apprentice who used to be a maintenance worker making $10 an hour. So she got quite a boost in pay when she became a sheet metal apprentice. She spoke of how her union had given her a second chance after she was released from jail, and how she felt proud to walk around New York City and know that people working in buildings where she had helped build the heating and cooling systems were now enjoying the fruits of her labor. Our day at Ford ended with Maureen Hennigan, the CEO of New York City-based Hennigan Construction, the firm that led the renovation on Ford Foundation's headquarters. She told the assembled crowd of asset owners and decision makers, when it comes to workforce diversity, it can come from you. You have the power. Many of you on this call work for organizations that oversee endowments or pension funds or other pots of money that are creating construction jobs. U.S. foundations are investing over $30 billion in real estate every year, with private foundations having about 3% of their endowments in real estate and community foundations about 1%. So it can come from you. You do have that power. People left our Ford gathering excited and with a new imagination of how things could be better in the construction industry. Tradeswomen really helped them see what the impact of their work was. We assumed they'd be lining up to get on the bus to adopt new policies, but strangely it didn't work that way. Fortunately, as we were learning this lesson, we were invited to join the Transform Finance Cohort based on job quality. We were especially pleased that 5 of our cohort partners were also seeking to affect change in the way construction industry is both financed and operates. Transform Finance has offered a rich web of relationships, both among the cohort participants and especially among the wonderful coaches that have opened their Rolodexes, or their whatever a modern Rolodex is called, their list of contacts, and given us new relationships, new possibilities, and deeper learning on how to flourish in this work. They've helped us develop new tools and resources that have helped us move forward. One example of those new tools is our Building Access and Equality Principles for Investing in Construction Careers booklet. In it, you'll find questions you can begin to ask your fund managers and model language that has been adopted by others, both some of the building trades language on responsible contracting, as well as diversity language that's come from municipalities. Eric is going to share a link to this document and other resources we have on a landing page after today's webinar. We've had dozens of wonderful phone calls and meetings following our Ford convening, and as a result of our Transform Finance work, we've learned that many foundations are addressing diversity in construction through their efforts to diversify their real estate managers and to insist on inclusion of minority and women-owned business enterprise contractors in their construction projects. While these are important issues, neither of them focuses directly on the on-the-ground experience of people who are actually doing the building. It would be like an equity investment prized on ESG grounds because it used beautiful organic cotton grown in a fair trade farm and then turned into wonderful sustainable clothing, only to later realize that the clothes were being assembled in a sweatshop. Eric mentioned earlier that we need to focus more on the S. That's true across all investing, but especially true in real estate portfolios. We know that all investments have impact, and through asking good questions, the current impacts of our real estate portfolios on construction workers can be better understood. With this knowledge in hand, directors and trustees and other decision makers can then begin to craft and adopt investment portfolios that more fully reflect the organization's values and mission. By asking strategic questions, we believe that real estate and infrastructure portfolios can become more aligned with organizational goals to create high-quality jobs and more inclusive and equitable societies. We believe the change is most likely to happen when institutions learn, grow, and respond together to what they have learned, and therefore we think creating mutual learning forums is an important organizing next step. One such opportunity to learn with your peers is coming up on December 6th in a webinar hosted by Manhattan Borough President and NYSERS trustee Gail Brewer. The conversation will feature New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, fiduciary experts, construction workers, and others talking about ways to move away from current models of exploitation of construction workers and towards one that are based on protection and equitable access. If you'd like more details, please feel free to contact me. I think the fine print in this slide is kind of small. In closing, we have a couple of asks to make. One's national in nature and one is local. We're really pleased to extend an invitation to all of you to participate in a cohort that we're forming with David Wood at the Initiative for Responsible Investment at Harvard's Kennedy School. Some of you probably know David and his work. This winter, we're forming a cohort of foundations, pension funds, and institutional investors interested in taking the next step to ensure quality, inclusive jobs within their real estate and infrastructure portfolios. We will support the cohort in becoming a community of learning and practice, and IRI will document the lessons learned for broader sharing. At the end of the process, we'll convene a large gathering of institutional investors to share best practices that can be broadly adopted. If you're in a position to influence your organization's endowment or fund, we welcome you to join our cohort. If you're not in that position, but maybe you can recommend others who might be interested and willing to join us on this journey of reflection. We're also seeking to fund and staff this support for this cohort. So if you have ideas for funding this effort, we'd love to hear from you as well. On the local front, we're launching a project in Denver in 2020. We have two aims for it. One is to do development differently and the other is to build differently. We want to do development differently by working together on bottom-up community developed projects instead of ones that are always top-down, in which communities are invited to the table late in the game. And we also aim to build differently, bringing local foundations and local labor unions together to build projects with quality job standards and strong diversity goals at the core, so that these can serve as benchmarks and models for other work in Denver and elsewhere. Thank you very much for this time and for allowing me to share my story. And we're particularly grateful to Transform Finance for inviting us to do this work. And we've loved working with AFIFA and all the other groups, and would encourage others to get involved if you have an opportunity in the future. I look forward to our time of questions and discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you also, AFIFA. I will see if I can pull back up our slide deck from before. And Eric, feel free to come in meanwhile if you would like with any comments. And I invite everyone also to let us know if you have any questions or comments in the chat. I saw Corey a request for sharing of the invite that we will do as always in the follow-up email with the recording when it becomes available. Yeah, in terms of the involvement as discussed, from those on the line, I imagine that there is some interest or even some eagerness to participate in this. From what we've seen from the folks that came to the strategy launch, as well as from the coaches, there is definitely no lack of interest in supporting, and the needs and the asks from the participants, from the cohort members, are many. So we will be sharing those with you. One thing that made me especially glad, that stuck out for me during the cohort, was, historically in many contexts we have seen a certain reluctance for for social justice leaders to show up somewhat vulnerably in conversations with finance, and there is a lot of justifiable kind of mistrust and a historical bad relationships that have led to this. And I noticed a high amount of eagerness to really get into the technical things and say, look, we are fighting, we're looking for some very concrete solutions here. We need concrete knowledge. If you are an expert, on real estate financing, I'm going to suck all that expertise out of you as opposed to focusing on the organization for which you might seem to work. And going back to Eric's earlier point, there is a way in which the cohort really contributes so much to the coaches themselves and to the speakers themselves, who really started viewing new ways in which they could be collaborating with organizations that they believe in and that normally are left in their after work hours type of organizing, and instead being able to leverage their daytime work for causes that they care about. So Eric, I will turn it over to you with that.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo one other thing, because I got to work with and prep and talk to all of the coaches and the folks with the financial expertise. I just want to really highlight the eagerness to support during their work hours. I really can't understate how heartening it was. Obviously, these are all folks that are values aligned and folks that we've come across through that might be on this investor network call now. But no one asked for anything, and it was almost as if they were equally as bought in as the participating organizations on the worker justice side. And we're actually going to rethink about how we do the coach participant dynamic in the future. But just really can't stress enough how heartening it is for us as well as for the participating organizations, seeing dozens of coaches that wear these kind of financial institution hats in their day jobs, just say, we want to help, this is great, not asking for honorariums, not asking for any kind of pats on the back, just saying like, this is, we have quotes from folks that have said, I can't think of a better way to spend my afternoon. This is a great group of folks. These are the types of people that I need to be talking to. And these are folks that manage tens, hundreds, a lot of money basically. So this idea, this Transform Finance general idea of like the bridge between the, quote unquote activists and the investors, we really got to see how very genuine that is. And when you kind of provide the opportunity and you frame it in a way that's equitable, there's a lot there, and far more there than actually we even originally predicted. So Andre, that's my last kind of comment. And then I guess we can just move into general discussion.
Yeah, and I will add one small thing there. I'm mindful now that I'm hearing this, I might sound a little bit like a little congratulatory lap for Transform Finance and the work that we've done. It wasn't supposed to be, self promotion, but I'm glad that that some complimentary things were said. And in fact, one thing that I would like to see if anybody among the attendees can speak to that is whether we should be plugging into other work from other organizations that could be complementary to this and also strengthen the work of the cohort members. Either on the line you might share or send us a note afterwards. And similarly, if you know of any best practices, we called this a cohort and we kind of designed it going on. Eric had a lot of conversations with folks that have run cohorts previously on different topics to see what are some good design elements. But, we were honored that these organizations were willing to experiment with us a little bit. So if you have any suggestions on how to improve on the next ones, we are all ears, and we're hoping to improve it as we go on. I don't see any audience questions at the moment, so we can give folks a second if they want to chime in, you should feel free to also, raise your hand and I can unmute you or put something in the chat. Otherwise, we can also close it off if there are no more comments. Great. So for those that are on the phone, I will repeat the suggestions that are here on the last slide that you can see. So we would love to hear about, we'd love to get your feedback and hear what your needs might also be as an investor or otherwise, or as a worker justice organization. I love this idea that came up from Scott's comments about, how they were able to formulate some of their suggestions with respect to construction jobs for foundations as something that is helpful for the investors, right? It's framed in a way that investors might actually benefit from themselves. Please share this work with relevant organizations, with your grantees who might want to participate in the future. I will note on that we are considering a future cohort on a different topic. Worker justice was very salient, and we will be repeating that for 2020, but we'll also be starting to design one that might be on another issue. So feel free to reach out with that. Share your knowledge with the cohort members. Very glad to see comments from a couple of the participants. Thank you very much about their willingness to be approached around a FIFA's fund idea to help with connections. Somebody mentioned deeper dives with the organizations, and yes, we will share the content and the organizational contact to the webinar attendees. Thank you for asking for that. And maybe we can close with this question that came in for the panelists. Scott, if you might want to address it. It says, what can investors do to improve their ESG practices? Were there also key learnings in terms of types of investments that foundations could make to help this area of work? Scott, is that something that Jobs for Justice looked at?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. And it's really the question we went into our February Ford meeting with. And there were some really good comments. Eric's also going to send around a 3-minute highlight video we made of that all-day meeting. And one of the things that was said was by Darren Walker at Ford, who said, I understand the fiduciary responsibilities and we need to be good stewards, but he also said it's really important for us to have a justice mentality. And to us, that means listening to the workers who are impacted by your investments. And I think that was the real power, both of the Ford meeting, as I said, and the one we had last Friday, were these women talking about how transformative it was when someone cared enough to say, we want a diverse workforce on this job. It's not that hard. It doesn't increase your costs. I think we went to Ford because we were celebrating both what Ford and Novo had done in their procurement. These were, admittedly smaller projects of, the Ford Foundation building, which isn't a skyscraper, and Novo offices, which are smaller than Ford, but they were transformative in the lives of the many dozen workers and people of color that worked on those projects for a year or more.
Great, thank you very much. And more broadly on the question, I think we're trying to proactively look at across asset classes, what are some of the interventions that can be done to improve the practices. There's been some great work in the public equities, which is not necessarily where many of us would look in terms of packaging and providing information that is actionable to investors, framed in a matter of investor risk. but really lifting up the information that the worker justice organizations and worker representatives have about the work conditions. We have done some work in the past around quality jobs and the application of job quality standards to private debt and private equity, where there, because of the substantial positions taken by the investor, you have more power to drive some of the changes that you might be looking for. But we can definitely follow up online on some of the areas that we've seen on the types of investments that foundations could be making in these areas of work. Wonderful. And with that, I would love to thank you all. Thank you, Scott and Afifa, and thank you, Eric, for all the great work with the cohort this past year and going forward. And I look forward to hearing more from you all, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.